Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Our mission here at FFF is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the libertarian philosophy. As part of our series on why it's time to end the war on drugs, I'm pleased to have as my guest Scott McPherson, who is policy advisor at the Future of Freedom Foundation and has been for many, many years. He's a regular contributor, has written countless articles for FFF. He's one of those uncompromising libertarians. We've worked together for a long time, and he's also the author of one of our great ebooks. It's called Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment, and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, which is just a fantastic presentation of gun rights and the importance of the Second Amendment. And so I asked Scott to come on and explain to us the reasons why he opposes the war on drugs. And so, Scott, nice to have you here. And that's the question I want to pose to you, and that's the question I want to discuss to you. You've been an ardent opponent of the drug war as a libertarian for a long time. Explain to us why it is that you want to legalize drugs.
Well, before I came on, I was just sort of thinking back to, how much time has gone by since I first started thinking about this issue and first started writing about the issue. And I was recalling walking around my neighborhood back in, I think it was 1999 or 2000. And I remember seeing a bumper sticker on a car, and it said, drugs are bad, the drug war is worse. And I really, it was such it caught my attention in part because, 17 years ago, nobody was talking about this stuff. It was a radical fringe issue that nothing but us kooky libertarians thought was worth discussing. And of course, it's exciting to see how much that has changed. But, I've always thought that really summed it up so well that, the libertarian position is in no way pro-drug. It's if anything, it's neutral on the issue of drugs. But we recognize the horrible disaster, the horrible harm, and both economic and moral harm that has come about as a result of our government going around imprisoning people and harassing people and militarizing our police force, all in the name of combating substances that people voluntarily put into their own bodies. And as a libertarian, ultimately I have to gauge behavior based on whether it is or it is not peaceful, and regardless of what I might think personally about individual actions that a certain person might take, if their actions are peaceful, then ultimately my job as a responsible citizen is to butt the hell out of their business, and certainly our government needs to adopt that same position.
Yeah, your point about this going on for a long time really is true. I mean, ever since I discovered libertarianism, the drug war has been central to the libertarian philosophy. I mean, it really embodies everything that's wrong with respect to government assaults on liberty and privacy. And I remember coming across an essay by Milton Friedman that he published in 1972 in Newsweek on why the drug war was so bad. And then he later wrote another one, an open letter to drug czar Bill Bennett in the Wall Street Journal in 1990. And those were lonely days for us libertarians when we were called for drug legalization. I mean, people were just outraged, but everything's changed now. I mean, the topic is on the table. States are legalizing drugs. There's really been a sea change, and I think the drug war is just teetering. The fact that the feds aren't enforcing their own drug laws in certain states, I think says it all. At least with respect to marijuana. Now, you brought up essentially the non-aggression principle of libertarianism, and we're saying that the drug war violates that. Would you go into an explanation as to what the non-aggression principle means and how it is that the drug war violates that principle?
Well, it's really based on the idea that we each, as individuals, as autonomous beings, own our own bodies. We're not slaves. We own our own bodies, and therefore we decide what we do with them. So long, and this is the important condition placed on that, is that so long as we do not violate the right of others to likewise do the same with their own bodies and, by extension, their own property. That is really the crux of the non-aggression principle, that I own myself. I have rights as an autonomous individual, and so long as I respect your rights, you have the moral responsibility. You are ethically bound to leave me be. And it's hard to find an issue today that stands in such stark contrast to the non-aggression principle than the war on drugs. The idea that because I take some often arbitrarily prohibited substance and put it into my body, that somehow that in and of itself justifies, SWAT raids and wiretapping and violations of privacy and civil liberties, all just to stop me from putting something in my body that I've chosen to do voluntarily, and that I've done in a manner that in no way affects you or violates your right to live your life as you see fit. It's difficult to imagine something that more at odds with just the basic concept of freedom that I would think anyone, regardless of their political persuasion, would be able to recognize and respect.
Yeah, it really is a phenomenal thing that when you look at it just in the overall context, that a person sits in the privacy of his own home and says, I'm going to do something destructive, self-destructive. And suddenly that triggers the authority of the police to barge into the house and arrest that person for doing something self-destructive and putting him in jail for 20 or 30 years. It's a phenomenal thing.
His family. I mean, an often untold part of that story is what happens to the children of these people. We spend a lot of time. There's been a lot of anxiety in the last few years in discussing the conditions that exist in many minority communities in this country, and not very many people, sadly, are talking about the impact that the war on drugs has had in creating those conditions. And, we talk about fatherless children, the epidemic of fatherless children. Well, it's certainly difficult to look after your children when you're sitting in a prison cell. And we could argue that, well, perhaps you weren't providing the best example, or you weren't being the best parent that you could be if you were, using drugs. Well, I can think of no shortage. We could write a book all by itself on all the other bad choices that people can make. But that doesn't mean that we somehow make the situation better by putting that person in prison, and then, by extension, leaving his children without a father or a mother. It's tragic. My goodness, look at video games. Nothing drives me crazier than watching the manner in which, today we don't even hesitate to stick a video game in front of a child. Most children these days are being raised by computer screens, for goodness sake. Are we going to start, barging into people's homes and confiscating their computers and putting them in prison? I certainly hope not.
Yeah, well, and the classic example is alcohol. We know that there's a lot of alcoholism in society, and yet where does the government gain the authority to go and grab somebody and put him in jail for a lengthy period of time because he's addicted to alcohol or tobacco or ingesting any other kind of substance that some people might consider destructive? Like I say, it's a phenomenal thing. You mentioned the racial aspects of this, and would you delve into what you meant by that on the drug war?
Well, sure. I think that there's there's been a lot of people, libertarians and a lot of people on the left that have pointed out, particularly over the last few years, what might be referred to as the racist roots of the war on drugs. And I think that there's both an overt racism within the war on drugs, and I think that there's a subtle racism within the war on drugs. And obviously, an example of the more overt side of the argument is, look at the statements and the actions of the politicians that were implementing it. Richard Nixon's probably best identified, apart from perhaps Reagan. Nixon is probably best identified with the war on drugs, and he was very explicit about the ability that this was going to give government to harass minorities and minority communities. I think on the more subtle side, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you give government and its agents massive amounts of power, then that is not going to be used against the politically powerful. It's the people who are the politically weakest in society that are most likely to suffer at the hands of an all-powerful government or its agent. And you'd be hard-pressed to find more politically powerless people in our society than those that are living in impoverished minority communities. So we have these communities that are in terrible condition, that are suffering from no shortage of issues that beyond the war on drugs. But so we throw into this cocktail this toxic mix of oppressive laws and aggressive militarized police who wish to enforce them, and we're surprised that race relations, particularly between minorities and the police, are in such a terrible state.
Yeah, I often say that not all cops are bigoted, of course, but there are bigoted cops. And the drug war, it seems to me, provides them with the perfect opportunity to exercise their bigotry. Stopping blacks on the streets and just patting them down, subjecting them to humiliating searches and abuse. And they can say, I'm just enforcing the war on drugs. I'm just doing my job. And people turn around and say, oh, well, thank you, for doing this. You're keeping America a drug-free society, which, of course, is ridiculous because America's not a drug-free society. It goes to the basic fundamental fact about the drug war. It's failed. It is never.
I think we should. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, Bumper.
Oh, it's never achieved what it's purported to achieve, which is a drug-free society. It's the exact opposite.
And I think we should stop letting police off the hook. There is this sort of game that we play in discussions about this topic, where particularly when we're talking to police officers or their apologists, and it usually goes something like this. Well, the police don't make the laws. They just enforce them. They're just doing their job. It's not their fault. Talk to your congressman. But you know what? Every time there is a discussion at the legislative level, go to any state capital in the country where a law is being discussed in committee that in some way reduces the power of the police or expands the freedom of the individual. And who are the first people you're going to see lining up to testify against that bill? Mm-hmm. And it's always police, and they're always in uniform when they do it. And no one ever points out the conflict of interest. So when somebody says to me, oh, well, police are just doing their job, well, I would point out, yes, they are doing their job. It's a job that they enthusiastically carry out. And so we should stop making excuses for them. They whether they're bigoted or not, they are people who, by and large, are lust after the power that they have, and they employ it with great enthusiasm.
Well, absolutely. But I think their actions are entirely rational because, to me, there's two major groups that favor drug laws. and that's the drug lords and the drug gangs. I mean, they wouldn't exist in the absence of the drug war because they can't operate in a legalized market. They're not able to participate in the competitive process. They operate under a black market where violence is the coin of the realm. But the other great constituency for the drug war are the people who are also benefiting from it, and that's the huge bureaucracy. The judges, the prosecutors, the law enforcement people, DEA, deputy sheriffs, police, court clerks. I mean, there's been this entire bureaucracy that depends on prosecutions and arrests. And I'm not talking just about bribes. I mean, that's certainly part of it, the corruption that the drug war brings to the judicial system and the law enforcement area. I'm talking about just basic salaries. So it doesn't surprise me that these people show up there and support the law. That it's like their jobs are at stake. But we need to put those jobs out of existence, just like we need to put the drug lords out of business. And that's what drug legalization would do, right?
I think so, and I would add one more group to this arrangement, and that is increasingly we're hearing calls for replacement of imprisonment with mandatory treatment, and I guess I would be very concerned that our mental health and our medical industry is going to get sucked into this nightmare, and how long before we're going to have mental health professionals testifying against the legalization of drugs because they know where their bread's buttered.
Absolutely. Now, what do you mean by the militarization of the police? I mean, we have in this country traditionally or historically a separation of the military, which is not supposed to be involved in law enforcement, and then we've got the police. And yet, as you're pointing out, you see an increasingly militarization of the police. What do you mean by that? Give us some examples.
Well, those old dead white guys that society seems so enthusiastic, so willing to spurn, and whose ideas and sentiments that were expressed at the founding of this country. These guys were very concerned about a standing army and the ability of a standing military force to impose tyranny on the people, and I could say that they were half right. What we have in the United States today is not a standing army that threatens our liberty. We have a standing police force. You go to just about any society or just about any community in this country, and you find police with machine guns and tanks and SWAT teams. I mean, I live in New Hampshire, which is arguably one of the safest states in the country. We didn't get this way because the chief of police of the Concord Police Department was given a tank a few years ago. We've always been, it's always been a peaceful state. And I could point to no shortage of other states and communities around the country where crime is virtually non-existent. But yet we've got the Department of Defense and the Pentagon sending tanks, armored vehicles, bayonets, for goodness sake, military equipment, surplus equipment from the military to our police officers who, by extension, have become the standing army the framers feared. A group of people who were willing to enforce the orders of those from above, regardless of the morality of those orders, against a citizenry that is effectively disarmed.
Yeah, your point about the tank reminds me of what people sometimes say about libertarians. Like, well, under libertarianism, would everybody be able to have a tank in their front yard? And my answer is, well, why not? If the police have tanks, why shouldn't the citizens have tanks?
I think it was Vin Suprinovich, the libertarian columnist, that pointed out that if the Branch Davidians had an anti-tank weapon, that would have gone a whole lot differently.
That's very true. Have you kept
up? I don't know that I would have a tank if it was legal, but I would certainly have an anti-tank weapon.
Yeah, well, see, that's an interesting point, is that with drug legalization, not everyone has to take drugs. I mean, it remains a choice. And for whatever reason, people want to ingest drugs. You and I can sit there and say, that's not the healthiest thing to do. But the argument that sometimes is made by those that support the drug war that if you legalize drugs, you're sending a message to young people and others that drug usage is okay. It's a good thing to do. Otherwise, why else would you make it legal? Do you see any fallacies in that line of thinking?
Well, I think there's two sides of that. I'm struggling to remember the author of, I believe the book was called Beyond the War on Drugs. It was written back in the 90s. And there was an interesting chapter that he had in that book on how if you look back at pretty much any society that has existed in the last, 10,000 years, there's always been an element within that society that has sought out some way to alter the reality. There's no serious civilization that has ever existed that hasn't had some means by which some people within that society seek to alter their reality. And so some people argue, well, it's sort of human nature. There's always going to be people that are going to do that, and I think that's absolutely correct that there will be. The idea that by making something legal, by legalizing a behavior or advocating a behavior, if we're going to go down that road, then man, we might as well all be locked up in cages from the moment we're born. Because while I have my issues with how bureaucratized and how overly legalized, or overly regulated our society is, we still are, I think, to a very large extent, a free society. And there's no shortage of things out there that people can choose to do that are bad for them. And if by those things being legal, we are encouraging them, then we better get busy and start passing a lot more laws and apparently putting a lot more people in prison so that we can save them from themselves.
Yeah, the example I use is adultery. I mean, who wants to criminalize adultery? Who wants to put people away for 20 or 30 years? And so by calling for the legalization of adultery, that certainly doesn't mean we're saying, hey, adultery is a good thing. It's simply saying, as you were pointing out earlier, under the non-aggression principle, that people should be free to make any choices they want in their lives as long as they're peaceful. They don't involve murder or rape or stealing or infringing on other people's rights. What about this guy in the Philippines? Have you been keeping up with him?
The president of the Philippines. I would think that there's probably quite a few people in the halls of Congress right now that are wishing they had the courage to take that position.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this guy's just taking the drug war to its logical conclusion. He's killing all the drug dealers. He's treating them like the U.S. government treats people in the war on terrorism. Just shoot them. You don't need no stinking trial. And I think he's killed about 3,000. And there's still a drug problem. I mean, it kind of goes to show the police state that you referred to that has to come into existence to even, tend toward a drug-free society. But my gosh, is that what we want? If that's obviously a minimal level of what it takes. The long jail sentences haven't worked. The asset forfeiture hasn't worked. The militarization of the police hasn't worked. And so this guy is saying, well, this is what works. I'll just kill drug law violators on sight. And that's the police state you're talking about, right?
Well, sure, and it kind of gets back to what I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, this idea that drugs are bad, but the drug war is worse. And, I mean, we'd be hard-pressed to find a better example of how much worse the drug war could get than a president of a country that wants to execute people just for using drugs. We have no trial. We don't need no stinking trials, as you said. We'll just put them to death. But I think that there's probably people out there, and I think we could find them on both sides of the aisle in the halls of Congress that would very much like to live in a society where police had even more power than they already do. And that's kind of a terrifying prospect. And when you've got this maniac out there setting that example, well, I mean, I guess we can only hope that perhaps reason will prevail. But, Singapore, if you chew gum in Singapore, they'll cane you, which is, potentially life-threatening. They probably don't have many people chewing gum in Singapore, but is that a trade-off we're really willing to make? I certainly hope not.
Well, that's essentially the trade-off we've made with the drug war. I mean, we really have sacrificed an enormous part of our liberty as a society with this thing. I mean, I really consider it the litmus test on a libertarian. I mean, there's a lot of inconsistencies that libertarians take, not you and me, of course, but
of course not.
But the drug war to me is the dividing line. If somebody supports the war on drugs, there is no way that he can genuinely be considered a libertarian. It's difficult for me to imagine a bigger assault on liberty and privacy.
I don't know how someone can reconcile the two. And I'd like, if we do have time, I would like to comment on a trend, though, that I'm seeing on, well, I guess we could call the political right for the sake of simplicity. And that is this idea that we should return the issue to the states. And I watched a brief interview with the conservative commentator Stephen Crowder the other day, where he was asked about the issue of marijuana legalization, and he said, "Well, I take the libertarian position on this. It should be handled at the state level." Well, driver's licenses should be handled at the state level, but that doesn't make it a libertarian issue. But then when pressed, he said, well, first of all, it should be handled at the state level, but if there was a vote in my state, and he stated this expressly, if there was a vote in my state, I would vote against marijuana legalization. So federalism has, as much as we might embrace federalism as a short-term solution or a better system than the more top-down type thing that we have now, I think that for a lot of conservatives, it's become a way to keep one foot in the statist or the authoritarian camp, while using libertarian-sounding language to promote themselves and to promote their own agenda. But it certainly isn't libertarian to argue that we'll let the states put people. Well, let's have the states putting people in jail rather than the federal government doing it. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because what difference does it make for a person who's minding his own business and ingesting his own substances if he's ending up spending 20 years of his life in a federal penitentiary instead of a state penitentiary? I mean, yeah, the Fed might be a little bit nicer place, but
another tactic they like to use is to argue that the numbers are inflated, that the position from the left and from libertarians that there are X number of people in jail for marijuana related offenses is inflated. I think, and that number varies anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million, depending on who you talk to. Well, my answer to that question, or to that position, is always, well, what is the correct number of people that should be in prison for when their only crime is using marijuana? And I think that there's a lot of conservatives out there that like to sound like libertarians, because it's kind of the flavor of the month right now. But what this allows them to do is when they adopt this federalist position, is they get to continue to promote the war on drugs, but pat themselves on the back for being ever so open-minded and libertarian about it. And it simply doesn't work. If someone's out there minding their own business, if they're not hurting anyone, if they're not violating the right of other people to live their lives in peace and as they see fit, then whether it's the local sheriff kicking down your door or the drug enforcement agency really makes no bit of difference to the person who suddenly finds himself with a gun in his face, or perhaps dead, or very likely in prison.
Yeah, I mean, there's horror stories at both the state and the federal level where people have had their lives ruined simply because they were selling drugs, because of the enormous black market prices that drug illegality brings into existence and attracts especially poor people into the trade, and that have just spent 20, 30 years. I mean, at least there's an implicit acknowledgement of this, where they're now starting to release people early. I mean, and these people are getting out of jail after 10 or 15 years. They don't know what's going on in life. It's very difficult for them to adjust, and all because they were doing something entirely peaceful. I mean, it's absolutely atrocious. Let's wrap it up with one last point that I'd like you to address. I mean, you've authored this fantastic ebook for us on gun rights and the Second Amendment called Freedom and Security. The Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. Do you see any relationship between the gun control issue and the drug war?
Well, sure. If you were to look at, I read today that Chicago just surpassed 600 homicides for the year. I don't think this is. I don't think it sets a record. There's probably had more homicides than that in a calendar year. Of course, let's bear in mind that the year isn't over yet. But it's been quite some time. It's been since the bad old days of the 80s and the 90s when crime in the United States was at its peak before we saw these kinds of numbers. And this is taking place in the city of Chicago, which has arguably the strictest gun control laws in the country. And I think that there most certainly is a connection between arguments for the drug war and arguments for gun control. These very same police officers that can't stand the sight of someone out there smoking marijuana for their own pleasure are the very same people that are uncomfortable with the idea that you might be out there walking the streets with a concealed handgun to use for your own defense. So I don't think it's surprising at all that we see cities like Philadelphia and Chicago and Washington, D.C., which are so heavily regulated as far as firearms are concerned, also have police departments that are extremely enthusiastic about enforcing the war on drugs. And I guess I would remind people on the right who consider themselves to be pro-Second Amendment people that if they're willing to allow peaceful behavior to be abolished by the state, then the whole "I'm a peaceful gun" argument kind of falls apart, doesn't it?
Yeah, same principle, and the drug war also adds to the violence in the sense that you've got all the gangs and the gang wars and people protecting their turf and all the shootings. I don't know what the statistics are, but I'm willing to bet that the greatest percentage of shootings in the inner cities are drug related, and then
right,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you go back to the days of alcohol prohibition, then you didn't have gangs settling their differences in court. You had them settling them with Thompson machine guns on the street corner, and we didn't learn a lesson from that, because now that we live in this society where drugs have certain drugs, I should say, have been prohibited. We now have drug gangs, just like we had alcohol gangs before, that are going about settling their differences with drive-by shootings and gang wars, and this really shouldn't be surprising to anybody. If I'm and of course, a common argument is, well, drugs are different. Well, it's funny, because if you go back 100 years ago, or slightly less than 100 years ago, when alcohol was illegal, they were saying the same thing about alcohol. Alcohol is different. Well, lo and behold, we abolished we repealed prohibition, and suddenly now you don't have people shooting one another over alcohol-related feuds. Well, I very much believe that while society's not going to become some peaceful utopia overnight, or even in the long term if we legalize drugs, if the past is any indicator, then we can most certainly count on an end, or certainly a radical reduction in the number of violent conflicts that arise surrounding the drug trade, if people are allowed to settle those disputes, capable of settling those disputes in a legal forum rather than on the street corner.
Yeah, I have no doubts that on the day that drugs are legalized, and I think that day is approaching, the level of violence in American society will plummet. So on that note, Scott, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your perspectives. This is a very, very immoral and destructive government program, and appreciate you sharing your reasons as to why it should be ended.
Thank you very much, Bumper. It was great talking to you.
Likewise.